Good afternoon. This is a home studio recording of an informal briefing to be given in various venues the fall and winter of 2024 on Bell Labs 2.0s towards reestablishing the nation's corporate research labs. I'm Jeff Tsao. Most of my career has been in physical sciences and engineering research, particularly semiconductor materials and devices. About 10 years ago, I began to dive deeply into meta-research, the study of research itself. And at this stage of my career, that's the work that occupies most of my time and energy. Why am I so interested in meta-research? Because my sense, beginning about 10 years ago and only reinforced as I got further into it, was that we didn't have a good understanding of the nature of research. So we didn't have a good understanding of how to nurture it. So there have been two parts to my agenda. The first part was to develop an improved and especially more actionable understanding of the nature and nurture of research. I think we've made good progress on that first part, as outlined in this book, co-authored with Venki Narayanamurthy in late 2021. The second part, the part I am interested in beginning to tackle now, is to build on that new understanding to propose actionable ways to improve the productivity of our research enterprise. One powerful way, I believe, is to reestablish the nation's corporate research labs. These labs were unique contributors to research throughout the 20th century, as epitomized by the iconic Bell Labs. But for a number of reasons that we'll discuss, they have come to play a relatively minor role in the current research ecosystem. So this talk is about the second part of my agenda. How might we improve the productivity of our research enterprise by adding corporate research labs to the mix, and how we might reestablish such labs? I'll start with a quick overview of some of the accomplishments of Bell Labs 1.0, the Bell Labs of the 20th century, and describe a powerful rubric for research that it executed time and again. Then I'll discuss in some detail 3 actionable guiding principles intended to enable institutions, what we might call a network of Bell Labs 2.0s, to execute that same powerful rubric, but in a 21st century form. The first guiding principle is inspire, don't constrain research by particular use. The second guiding principle is fund research at the institution, not individual researcher level. The third guiding principle is evolve research institutions by retrospective competitive reselection. These guiding principles, taken together, severely restrict how the network of Bell Labs 2.0s must be funded and organized. In particular, each Bell Labs 2.0 must be block funded. Each Bell Labs 2.0 must be hosted and cost shared by problem-rich mission organizations, but its majority funding must be from a funder with a broader societal benefit mindset. And each Bell Labs 2.0 must compete with the others in a network of Bell Labs 2.0s for selection and reselection at the institution level and on a decadal scale rhythm. But the guiding principles also leave significant room for experimentation on the internal organization and philosophy of the research institutes. On the one hand, the guiding principles are not meant to be over-prescriptive. There are many things we still don't know about nurturing research, so leaving these things open to experimentation is important. On the other hand, the guiding principles are also not meant to be under-prescriptive. There are many things we do know about nurturing research, so these things should not necessarily be open to experimentation. Finally, I'll close with a strawman funding opportunity announcement that makes the funding model more concrete. Taken together, I feel like this really could be revolutionary. If we could reestablish a network of corporate research labs like the Bell Labs of the 20th century, what Mervyn Kelly, its president for many years, called an Institute of Creative Technology, we would be taking a big step towards improving the productivity of the nation's research enterprise. Let's start with a quick overview of Bell Labs 1.0. Here I show a list of some of its most impactful accomplishments. I list only accomplishments that were awarded the most prestigious of awards: Nobel Prizes, Turing Awards, IEEE Medals of Honor, Draper Prizes, National Medals of Science or Technology, and Medals for Merit. Of course, there were many accomplishments that were not awarded these, even though they were perhaps worthy of them. There is much politics associated with awards. Still, this is an impressive list, one that includes 11 Nobel Prizes and 5 Turing Awards. I'm not going to go through the accomplishments in detail, but would like to point out that almost all of them share a powerful research rubric. The rubric has 3 stages, indicated at the top in brown, red, and purple. The first stage in brown we call Inspire Research by Use. In this stage, AT&T's core business of communications defined a real-world space of uses and potential uses. Empowered leadership was inspired by those uses to organize a critical mass of researchers and cutting-edge technologies to explore the frontiers of the problem space associated with those uses. For Bell Labs 1.0, one might broadly characterize the problem space as how to understand and control the electrons and photons that carry information, and how to algorithmically process and control the information itself. And in exploring that problem space, I want to emphasize cutting-edge technologies. Bell Labs 1.0 was first and foremost an institute of creative technology, informed by, but not held back by, the incompleteness of scientific understanding. The second stage in red we call Seek and Pivot to Surprise. In this stage, researchers in their explorations of the problem spaces are encouraged to seek surprise, and when they find it, to pivot to it. This is an echo of Alexander Graham Bell's famous words taken very seriously at Bell Labs. Leave the beaten track occasionally and dive into the woods. Every time you do so, you will be certain to find something that you have never seen before. Follow it up, explore all around it, and before you know it, you will have something worth thinking about to occupy your mind. The third stage in purple we call Don't Constrain Research by Use. In this stage, researchers, having sought and pivoted to surprise, find other uses beyond the original use they were inspired by. They might find that they also can benefit the original use. That's, of course, good. But spillover into broader societal benefit also counts as success. This is super important because surprise, by definition, can't be anticipated. So all the more, the use that surprise leads to can't be anticipated. But because the starting point for the surprise is real-world use that society cares about, it is not unlikely that the end point of the surprise will also be a use that society cares about. If not by AT&T, then by other companies or other sectors of society. This is what some, beginning with Stuart Kauffman, have called the adjacent possible. To make this rubric more concrete, let me run through it on the next slide using the accomplishments highlighted in blue as exemplars. Karl Jansky's founding of the field of radio astronomy, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley's invention of the transistor and discovery of the transistor effect, Horst Stormer, Dan Tsui, and Art Gossard's discovery of the fractional quantum Hall effect, and Yann LeCun's advances in deep learning. The first exemplar is Karl Jansky. In the 1930s, he was looking to track down noise from radio antenna. That quest was inspired by radio communications as a use, and his approach was to put together a clever so-called Jansky merry-go-round technology that enabled a simple but sensitive directional radio antenna to be steered over a full 360-degree rotation. What he found was a surprise, a mysterious source of static. Pivoting to that surprise enabled him to determine that the source tracked the position of the Milky Way, which led to the founding of the field of radio astronomy. Of course, radio astronomy wasn't itself of interest to AT&T, so eventually he was steered towards other problems. And he passed away young, so didn't live to see radio astronomy really take off in the 1950s. And also didn't win what some think should have been a Nobel Prize. But of course, the founding of the field of radio astronomy was of huge interest to human society. The second exemplar is John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley. In the 1940s, Bell Labs was looking to explore semiconductors as a means to replace bulky and inefficient vacuum tubes. That quest was inspired by amplification of telephone signals as a use. What they found was the well-known surprising twist and turn of device structures that they thought would work, then didn't, then new mechanisms to explain why they didn't work, then new device structures that finally did work, then new explanations for why these did work, then yet newer device structures that worked even better. The result was analog amplification, which of course benefited AT&T's communications use. But also unexpected was that computation, which at the time was a very small market compared to communications, would end up being the bigger impact of the transistor. AT&T was at the time forbidden from entering the computation business, so didn't benefit from this. But of course, modern computation has been of huge importance to human society. The third exemplar is Horst Stormer, Dan Tsui, and Art Gossard. In the 1980s, AT&T was looking for ever faster transistors for its communications use. To do so, Bell Labs had invented new materials synthesis techniques like molecular beam epitaxy that would allow exploration of novel materials and device structures. One of those structures, grown by Art Gossard, turned out to give ultra-high electron mobilities, which were indeed useful for high-speed transistors. But these structures also yielded a surprise: plateaus in quantum Hall measurements corresponding to non-integer electronic charge. Horst Stormer and Dan Tsui pivoted to this surprise and ended up discovering a new quantum electronic state of matter and transforming our understanding of electrons in solids. The fourth exemplar is Yann LeCun. In the 1982 to 1984 years, AT&T was broken up by antitrust and in exchange was allowed to enter the computation business. It quickly began to look at computational technologies of the future, one of which was computer vision, and within computer vision, the use case of optical handwritten character recognition. This inspired Bell Labs to develop neural network technology. Then, when Yann LeCun joined Bell Labs in 1988, he made a surprising suggestion, not necessarily surprising to him, but certainly surprising to the larger community. Suppose, instead of making use of a priori knowledge about features associated with the handwritten characters, do end-to-end training using two emerging technologies, convolutional neural networks and backpropagation as a method for training the convolutional neural nets. The suggestion worked and did benefit the original use case of optical handwritten character recognition. But the major impact of Jan LeCun's work was on the larger field of deep neural networks and deep learning. This larger field didn't take off until the 2010s and was not monetized by AT&T, but of course was catalyzed by Jan LeCun's work. To sum up this slide, this rubric, shared by all these exemplars, is a powerful one. Use inspiration from anticipatable mission utility, then surprise, then perhaps some benefit back to anticipatable mission utility, but much larger benefit to an unanticipatable and much more important societal benefit. And each stage of the rubric is important. Inspire research by use provides a critical mass of researchers and technologies to explore the problem space and guarantees that the next stages of the rubric are not too far from real-world use or potential use. Seek and pivot to surprise guarantees that knowledge is disruptive, hence advanced the most. Don't constrain research by use means that the unanticipatable larger societal benefit that results from the surprise is considered a success, hence encouraged, not discouraged. And this leads directly to the first of our three guiding principles. That first guiding principle is inspire, don't constrain research by particular use. Here I've rotated the diagram on the last slide so that anticipatable mission benefit is at the bottom and unanticipatable societal benefit is at the top. I've also now drawn the three stages of the rubric as arcs with either utility or surprise seeking in between. And I've drawn four different rubrics, permutations of the three stages, with the corporate research lab rubric in blue. Let's run through the four rubrics in turn, along with the funding models down here at the bottom that they correspond to. The first rubric is what we might call corporate development. Here we are inspired by uses relevant to a mission. But when we encounter surprise, when we encounter a new idea or a new observation that takes us away from our original use inspiration, we occasionally pivot towards it. That's this dashed arc up here, but mostly we don't pivot towards it. We constrain ourselves by the original use. If we're after a Moore's law improvement in chip scaling, that's what we're after. And I want to emphasize that calling this rubric corporate development should not convey a pejorative flavor at all. It is what enables U.S. corporations and mission organizations to be as competitive as they are worldwide. It is what enables them to explore in a targeted, goal-oriented manner the frontiers of science and technology, just as Moore's law pushes the frontiers of microelectronics chip technology. The second rubric is what we might call corporate research. Again, I want to emphasize that calling this rubric corporate research should not convey any sense of superiority over corporate development. It is just a different rubric, and both rubrics are important. But this is the Bell Labs 1.0 and 2.0 rubric that is of interest in this talk. Just like before, we are use-inspired. But unlike before, we seek surprise, and when we find it, pivot to it. This can lead to societal benefit well beyond the initial inspiration, like the transistor giving birth to modern computation. This is not to say that the transistor didn't also benefit amplification of telecommunication signals of interest to AT&T. That's this dashed arc pointing downwards. But the major benefit was to modern computation, even if AT&T did not monetize that. And the 20th century Bell Labs could afford to do that. It could be altruistic and not monetize the enormous societal benefits that its research resulted in because it was a monopoly and had monopoly profits. Of course, in the 21st century, monopolies are highly discouraged, if not illegal. One can make the argument that monopolies should be allowed, just regulated. But an alternative to this would be a public-private partnership. This is the Bell Labs 2.0 funding model we have in mind. Corporations with their real-world use and problem-rich environments host and cost share. But another organization, one with public goods and larger societal benefit in mind, provides the majority of the funding. This allows the corporate research lab to have the best of both worlds, to be inspired but not constrained by particular use. The third rubric is what we might call academic development. Here, research is not inspired by known real-world use. It is inspired by some abstract use, including simply curiosity. But because most funding agencies increasingly care about real-world use, their funding is project-based and typically must show relevance to that real-world use. So as we all know, in the trenches of research, there is some gaming involved in proposal writing. You claim in your proposal that your project will be relevant to the real-world use, even if you might know that, because you started from a very abstract place, it may not be likely. And then, after the research is done, there are, of course, significant valleys of death as one tries to tech transfer to real-world use. The fourth rubric is what we might call academic research. Here, research is also not inspired by real-world use. It is inspired by some abstract use, again, including simply curiosity. But when it encounters surprise, it pivots to that surprise. This is the kind of blue sky research epitomized by Albert Einstein. And this is the domain of funding models like Genelia or the HHMI Investigators Program. Finally, let me mention the interesting asymmetry between the academic development rubric and the corporate research rubric. The academic development rubric begins with freedom, then seeks practical use. The corporate research rubric begins constrained by practical use, then gives freedom. Let's now turn to our second guiding principle. Fund research, execute research at the institution, not individual researcher level. This is, of course, opposite to the dominant mode of research funding in the US. In that dominant mode, research is matrix funded by grants to single PIs in academia or to groups of PIs distributed across academia. Professors who accept these grants become partially autonomous from their universities. They are, to some extent, free agents, contract researchers who use their universities as home bases, but contract with funding agencies for most of their research funding. This freedom is, of course, the strength of the matrix funding model. No one, not even the chair of the department or the dean of the school, can tell a tenured professor what to do or organize professors if they don't want to be organized. And for goods and services whose production processes are straightforward, organization isn't needed, and individual contracts in a marketplace can work. Drivers contracting to be Uber drivers, for example. But for goods and services whose production processes are not straightforward, that require collective action on the part of multiple individuals. Individual contracts quickly become too complex to coordinate. The back-end engineers that create and maintain the information management infrastructure associated with Uber, for example, are employees, not contractors of Uber. Such less straightforward to produce goods and services are much more efficiently produced by firms, as the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase first noted in his theory of the firm. The complex choreography of resources to produce goods and services benefits from empowered leaders with tacit contextual knowledge. Firms, instead of contracting with individuals, hire them and then coordinate their collective activities. Why should research be any different? It shouldn't be. There is no reason to think that the research that produces scientific and technological knowledge is more straightforward than the production of other goods and services. If anything, it is less straightforward. Research, with its enormous uncertainties, all the more requires a firm that can flexibly organize resources. Let's call this a research institution, one that is block-funded and that employs researchers rather than contracts with independent external researchers. Most importantly, it has leadership that is empowered, and especially empowered to nurture research. What do I mean by nurture research? Here I list 3 things to the right of this triangle: people, culture, and organization that must be nurtured, as Venki and I discuss in our book, and that also have been discussed more recently by others, including Paul Smaldino and James Phillips. First, people. People must be nurtured with care and accountability throughout their careers. They might need to switch fields or jobs. They might, for various reasons, go through an extended period during which they appear to be less productive. They might need mentoring and coaching. No one, no matter how senior, couldn't benefit from coaching. Even Novak Djokovic, perhaps the greatest tennis player of all time, still needs a coach. Second, culture. With researchers hired and on board, it is easy to say, these are adults, let them free run and surely they will produce surprise. Nothing could be further from the truth. Venki and I like to say we are humans first, intellects second. We respond first and foremost to the social cues around us. What is rewarded and what is not. What is accepted and what is not, before we turn our intellects on. Empowered leadership is needed to build a culture of holistic technoscientific exploration. Technoscientific exploration, in turn, involves 3 cycles. I don't have time to go into detail, so we'll just mention the 3 cycles. One we call the S. and T. cycle, with scientific and engineering research feeding on each other. Another we call the Q. and A. cycle, or question and answer finding cycle, with the finding of new questions just as important as answering those questions. And the last one we call the R&D cycle, in which surprise to and consolidation of established knowledge feed on each other. Third, organization, and in particular, alignment of organization with research. Research requires collisions between ideas in different, but not too different, knowledge spaces. It requires a critical mass of researchers in those knowledge spaces, and building such critical mass doesn't just happen by itself. It requires leaders to build capability and allocate resources. All this is to say that disruptive new knowledge is non-trivial to produce and benefits from a research institution, a firm dedicated and optimized to producing it. Let's turn finally to our third guiding principle, principle, evolve research institutions by retrospective competitive reselection. This is very different from most research institutes, illustrated in red at the top, which are captive to their research funder. For example, Genelia is captive to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and is virtually guaranteed funding without competition. This is the case even for research institutes that are cost shared by a mission organization, like ARC-NL, the Advanced Research Center for Nanolithography, which is funded partly by the Dutch Research Council and partly by ASML, the lithography giant. And it was certainly the case for the corporate research labs of the 20th century, such as Bell Labs 1.0. Here, what we propose is competitive, not captive, research institutes, with the funding model illustrated in blue at the bottom. There are a number of institutes, call them Bell Labs 2.0s, and each one is hosted and cost shared by a different mission organization. The mission organizations could be private corporations, or they could be government organizations. What's important is that the organization have a mission that brings it into contact with the real world and with a real world problem-rich environment. I emphasize here that it is easy to think the opposite, that a mission organization is too practical and is not an appropriate host for a research institute. We are of course arguing the opposite, that the real world is what scientific and technological knowledge is about. So close integration with the real world's problem-rich environment is critical. Then, although these institutes are hosted and cost shared by mission organizations, they are majority funded by a research funder separate from the mission organization. The research funder could be a government agency, or it could be a philanthropy. What's important is that the research funder reward broader long-term impact. In other words, it is fine and good to be inspired by the mission organization's problem-rich environment, but as a researcher is attacking those problems and finds something surprising, the researcher must opportunistically pivot to that something that is surprising. Since by definition, no one can know the ultimate impact of surprise, it is not unlikely that the major impact will lie outside the narrow and shorter term focus of the mission organization. Thus, research requires its own external source of funds. What's important for this guiding principle is that the research institutes be separate from the research funder. If instead the research institutes were subsumed into the research funder, there would be no accountability. The research funder must be external to the research institute so that it can hold them accountable to research excellence through competition with other research institutes. Moreover, that accountability must be largely retrospective. Of course, choosing the research institutes to begin with must involve prospective selection, but the continuation of research institutes must involve retrospective selection. And moreover, such retrospective selection can be done. Although we don't at all know how to predict disruptive new knowledge and societal benefit ahead of time, we can judge it with better fidelity afterwards. The Nobel Prize Committee does this every year as it decides whom to reward. Okay, these were the 3 Bell Labs 2.0 guiding principles. Let me finally take a very rough crack at a strawman FOA, a strawman funding opportunity announcement, one that could be released on behalf of a government funding agency or a philanthropy, or even a combination of a government agency and a philanthropy for a network of Bell Labs 2.0s across the nation. Eligible applicants. These, we are imagining, would be mission organizations, whether public or private, whether nonprofit or profit, It could be a private corporation active in an AI problem space. It could be a private corporation active in a renewable energy problem space. It could be an educational institution that both educates as well as is interested in innovative ways to improve education. It could be a government agency with a national security mission. What is important is that the organization face real-world problems and is trying to accomplish real-world missions. Estimated funding. This new funding model requires, of course, scale in order for competitive reselection to be an integral part of it. So if we imagine a network of 10 research institutes at about $125 million per year with a 20% or so cost share, then we're talking about an overall program cost to the funding organization of about $1 billion per year, or $10 billion total over 10 years. That's a very large number, but for the potential productivity of these research institutes and in the context of the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars per year spent now on research, it is not that large a number. Selection criterion. This is where the initial selection of the starting 10 research institutes is done. One possibility is selection for knowledge domain and management plan that would best enable the research institute to change the way we think and or do with the broadest long-term potential societal benefit. Renewal criterion. This is where the rubber hits the road, and this is the single most important aspect of the Bell Labs 2.0 funding model. This is now a retrospective evaluation, and we wanted to include both degree to which knowledge has been disrupted, as well as degree to which the disruption has been broadly beneficial to society. This criteria would perhaps echo the Nobel Prize criteria, except that it would have an equal emphasis on science and engineering rather than the Nobel Prize's historical emphasis on science. Renewal period. Because the impact of research cannot be known right away, the research institutes must be given time, perhaps something on the order of 10 years or so. And the renewal must have teeth. From the outset, it must be clear that at least a few of the research institutes will not be renewed, so that there is a real competition between the research institutes. Miscellaneous guidelines. Finally, if we're serious about learning best practices from these research institutes, we might add as a guideline that they would make themselves open to meta-research studies by social scientists. With that, thank you.